Hi, welcome to Grow Smart Maine's Municipal Tools to Support Farming as a Climate Strategy webinar. My name is Maggie Fleming, and I am the Grow Smart Maine Board Vice Chair and Executive Committee Chair. Today's panel will be moderated by Harold Bresden, Thought Leadership Program Director. We have three distinguished panelists today: Judy East, Director of the Bureau of Resource Information and Land Use Planning with the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry; David Herring, Executive Director of the Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment; Scott Vaughn, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Ecology-Based Economy. And we'd like to take a moment to thank our webinar sponsor, Kennebec Savings Bank. I would like to honor the people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. These people are the traditional inhabitants of the lands of the state of Maine, and no matter where you are watching from today in Maine, you're in traditional Wabanaki territory. In thinking about your personal relationship with Maine and the future opportunities for the state during today's webinar, please consider the relationship that members of the Wabanaki Confederacy have shared and continue to share with this place as well. So why are we here today? The purpose of this webinar is to discuss land use and planning policies and strategies that communities can use to support climate smart agriculture and to make local farms and farmland a key resource for responding to climate change. Today's program will be 90 minutes and we'll leave time at the end for audience Q&A. I encourage you to turn your videos on, but please remember to keep yourself on mute during the panel. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand or type questions into the chat box. And today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. Also, we'll send a feedback survey after the webinar. I'm now going to turn it over to Harold.
Yeah, my name is Harold Bredesen, and I'm the Program Director for Planning for Ag. And this webinar is a part of our cooperation with the American Farmland Trust on Planning for Ag. Planning for Ag is a program that provides support to municipalities who would like to protect their farmland and farm viability through their local planning processes. There's also an element of this program that is about advocacy at the state level, advocating for farm protection and farm viability through state legislation. I think we have a very interesting group of participants and panelists here today. Each of the panelists have a lot of experience with the subject matter, but they all approach this from different angles. And I'd like to begin with Dave, who is the Executive Director of Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment.
Director at Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment, based in Freeport, historically known as Wolf's Neck Farm. We farm on land, the historic lands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and do our best to honor and follow their wisdom throughout our practices at Wolf's Neck. To me, it's actually kind of a good indication that we're having this conversation today. 11 and a half years ago, when I started as Executive Director at Wolf's Neck Farm, people didn't really talk about food and climate in the same topic, in the same conversation. It wasn't really part of that consciousness. It's not that there wasn't a lot to talk about, but it wasn't recognized in the same way that it is now, and that the importance of having this conversation is timely and important. So I'm happy to be here and talk about it. I would say that we probably all can agree that any viable path to solving the climate crisis and increasing our resilience must include a major focus on land management, to include forests and open spaces and agricultural lands. With roughly half of the Earth's land surface in some sort of agricultural production, a significant opportunity lies just beneath our feet. And adopting management practices that increase soil organic matter, enhance biodiversity, and in general support more life will help us become more resilient as land stewards, including farmers, ranchers, and forestries, as well as communities, and help us draw down atmospheric carbon, increase biodiversity, and help us become more resilient in the face of a changing climate. Our work at Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment is focused on building a community of people who care about the future of food and the planet, training and preparing the next generation of farmers and food systems leaders, and building and supporting collaborations throughout the food system that will help expedite the implementation of climate smart agriculture. I'm pleased to be here today, and I look forward to diving into these topics with you over the course of the next hour or so.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Weird, my unmute button wouldn't work. Anyway, hi everybody. Yeah, like Harold said, my name's Scott Vlan. I'm the executive director here at the Center for an Ecology-Based Economy. We're over here in Norway. We were happy to celebrate our 10th birthday on Earth Day. We're a climate justice focused organization, and we work across a broad range of different topics, food being central to it all. We work in food, shelter, energy, and transportation. I came to this work as a photographer, oddly enough. I've always been a gardener, but one of my first gigs out of graduate school was working for an organic seed company called Seeds of Change. And they cut me loose around the country, going to organic seed farms to photograph seed growers and actually photograph plants for the seed packs and all that kind of stuff. And on my travels, I got an education that I could never have bought any other way. Every farmer I met had, something to say about climate change, especially the people that have been on the same land for a long time. Climate change became an increasingly big topic through my almost 2 decades of working in that field. And when that kind of ran out, I had a child. I was here in Western Maine, and all that traveling wasn't really working for me anymore. So myself and a few other people decided it would be time to make a stand on climate here in Western Maine, and food has been central to that. So we've been working on a bunch of different food-related projects here. We started an edible Main Street, was one of our first projects. We grow food out on the street in front of CB here. We're right on the main street. We collaborated with our local community garden on a food forest project, and that kind of, I'm permaculture trained as well. I got into permaculture through Seeds of Change, and that idea of perennial polyculture is really intriguing to me. So we've been working with our local community garden. We have about 1/2 acre of food forest over there. It's actually grown a little bit over time. And part of the work I've done with CB, we have a local food council here, Community Food Matters. We're one of a network, the main network of community food councils. Before I was full-time here with CB, I was half-time with CB and half-time as the coordinator of the network of community food councils, and also was one of the founders of the Maine Food Convergence Project. So this notion of local food systems is, is really important to the work that we do here, even though we are, like I said, a climate justice focused organization. And I think food justice is climate justice and vice versa. So I'm happy to be here with everybody and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. Judy, you want to?
Sure. Thanks, Harold. Hi, everybody. So my background is in land use planning at the, local, regional, and state level. I spent 10 years in the 90s working for the Vermont Land Trust, doing land conservation projects, some farmland, a lot of black bear habitat. And moved to Maine in the early 2000s. I'm currently working with the state of Maine. That's been relatively recent. I spent 17 years as the executive director for the Washington County Council of Governments, working with municipalities, providing technical assistance. And during that time, my husband and I farm 6 acres in Calais. Lots of permaculture. I hear you on that score. The grapes that we planted 3 years are going to yield this 3 years ago. Will be their first bearing year, which will be wonderful because they'll coincide, their harvest hopefully will coincide with when we are having our daughter's wedding here on the farm in September. So And the apple orchard and the blueberries will contribute to the pies that my daughter prefers rather than cake for her wedding. So it'll be a local food celebration. And I'll leave it at that. Looking forward to, oh, I guess one other thing I'll mention is that I serve as the co-chair of the Maine Climate Council Working Group on Community Resilience, Planning, Emergency Management, and Public Health. And so a lot of what I bring to this conversation also comes from working on that working group. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So I wanted to just kind of, before we kind of go into the individual presentation, I think probably everybody who has logged on to participate in this webinar are fairly familiar with, you know, climate change and the impact it has, especially on agriculture. But I kind of wanted to highlight, you know, some of what we are seeing and what we can probably expect to see more of, and that is, you know, the longer growing season, droughts, more intense droughts, and more intense flooding. I think there's more research into developing new types of seeds that are more resistant to for example, a heat that might need less water, etc. New pests and diseases. And I think another thing is also perhaps you know, market uncertainty. And I think I find a very interesting example of that is a few years ago when Aroostook actually was a exporter of potatoes to Washington State, and Washington State is the second biggest producer of potatoes after Idaho, and I think Maine was the fifth. But because of drought hitting, you know, other markets or other producers in other parts of the U.S., suddenly there might be crops that are more relevant and less relevant, etc., as kind of as a result of climate change. And I'm also very happy that I think everybody, at least on the panel and me as well, have, you know, have experience farming. And I just also wanted to note that Dave is kind of our farmer panelist here. Can I call you that? Is the only one who's received a very significant USDA funding, I think 35 million for their climate smart commodities program. And I realized that's not only for Woolsnake, really, that's for Woolsnake managing a huge program with lots of different farmers and partners nationally. But I think that kind of puts you, David, in a very a good position to begin to kind of explain to us a little bit what is climate smart agriculture. I think I talked about this webinar to somebody the other day, and it was like, oh, I just learned what regenerative agriculture is. Now I have to learn this as well. So maybe we have organic agriculture, conventional, regenerative, etc. So maybe you can help clarify a little bit what climate smart agriculture is, and kind of what the practices is, what's the actual things that you do that is climate smart, and how it benefits both you as a farmer and the climate. I think that would be a great place to start.
Sure. Thank you for that, Harold. Yeah, big topic and lots to talk about. And so I think I've been allotted 10 minutes. Am I correct on that? Yep. So I'm gonna see if I can charge through some stuff here and touch on a number of fronts, and hopefully it's going to be of interest for folks, and we can certainly circle back and talk and answer questions and things like that. So first thing that I would say to kind of open up, so I grew up in Michigan, lots of farming happening in Michigan. But when I grew up there, I spent a lot of time camping, hiking, backpacking with my brothers, my dad, and friends and things like that. And every time we would get to a trail or be on the trail or get to a campsite, my dad would say, all right, boys, we gotta leave this place better than we found it. And we didn't ever really necessarily know what that meant, other than he had us picking up trash that other people had left behind. And it's like, that's the only thing I could think of that was like, okay, I'm leaving this campsite better. But I had no idea really at that time the significance of that ethic, and as it relates to as it became and related to me as a person, and the path I would pursue. So when I think about regenerative agriculture, and there are lots of different definitions that you would see out there, or climate smart agriculture. I guess the first things I would say is an accurate portrayal of the history of this continent would tell us that indigenous people have been practicing this ethic of climate smart agriculture for thousands of years before Europeans showed up. So it's important to acknowledge that in any conversations about regenerative agriculture or climate smart agriculture, this is not a new idea. This is not a new solution, but our framing of it and our context of it is absolutely new. And so when we think about leaving this place better than we found it, you think about the way that we think about land ownership. Nobody owns the planet, right? But we have somehow broken up this country and the world into portions of land that each of us own. But at the end of the day, we all rely on the Earth's natural resources to sustain our lives, to sustain the health of ourselves and our families and our communities, and we rely on land stewards, being foresters, agriculturalists, farmers, to steward our shared natural resources in a way that benefit all of us. And of course, absolutely, many of them are. There's no question about it. There's plenty of farmers out there doing exactly what the earth needs them to do, and exactly what we all need them to do. But when we think about the shifts in agricultural production that have taken place over the last 100 years as part of the Industrial Revolution, food has increasingly become about yields and profit, and less about the outcomes that are as a result of food production. And so we at Wolf's Neck Center are focused on training and demonstrating and building collaborations around a set of practices that fall under the broad header, I guess, of climate smart agriculture and regenerative agriculture. It's important to note, I guess, as we talk about this, because I know that you had asked me, Harold, to differentiate a bit between organic and conventional from regenerative and climate smart. And I guess a few things that I would say about them to kind of help us think about it. So organic is a label. The organic label is, when we think about it, it's a label that we can find in the grocery store. That's a program of the USDA and the National Organic Program. And very often, organic agriculture would absolutely fit into the practices of regenerative agriculture, but not always. And so the problem, I think, that we've run into a little bit with organic agriculture as it relates to and corresponds with climate smart agriculture or regenerative agriculture, is that organic agriculture is based on what happens at the beginning of the process. A farmer added this or didn't add this. A farmer used these seeds or not these seeds. A farmer applied fertilizer or didn't apply fertilizer. And I think that the shift that we're seeing happening is that in order for us to really understand and harness the power beneath our feet, being in agriculture and in soil health, it's important that we focus on the outcomes. So shifting to the other end of the spectrum, not what we did as farmers at the beginning of the process, but what happened over time to our land and what are the outcomes at the end. And so climate smart agriculture or regenerative agriculture are terms for a type of agriculture that's focused on those outcomes, focused on positive outcomes, positive environmental outcomes, positive social and economic outcomes, but specifically focused on building soil health and increasing biodiversity. And there are a number of practices or suite of practices that include cover cropping, applying compost, low or no tillage, and increasing diversity on the land by introducing livestock and avoiding monoculture cropping systems. generally, the less and reducing soil disturbance and allowing the soil to support more life and improving conditions and producing measurable outcomes are really important ways to be thinking about climate smart agriculture and regenerative agriculture. I can't remember, Harold. You want me to roll on here? Do you want me to pause so you can ask me questions?
Well, yeah, I think you mentioned soil health and if you could say something about soil health and why that is kind of important, especially like in a climate when there is in a climate change kind of context, both in terms, I guess, of carbon and carbon storage and also in terms of water flooding, possibility to store water.
Absolutely. So you heard me talk about some of the suite of practices that fit in under the umbrella of regenerative or climate smart agriculture. And when you think about what do each of those mean, using cover cropping or applying compost or reducing tillage, if you wanted to take it kind of one step back, it's really about keeping the soil covered and increasing the life and the bacterial life in soil. And the organic matter in soil. And when we do that, we know that soil can retain more water to make us more resistant to droughts. We know that it can absorb water, and water infiltration will be better in the face of more rapid and extreme rain events. We know that when soil is covered through cover crops or through grazable acreage or through annual or perennial crops, we know that photosynthesis is happening. And photosynthesis is the natural process that allows us to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil. And when we keep the soil covered, it allows us to store carbon there. And so when we talk about solving climate change, think about the last time you took a flight from the East Coast to, let's just say, Denver. You look out the window and you're looking at that patchwork of farmland that you fly across, where so much of our food comes from in this country. What colors are you seeing? Are you seeing brown? Are you seeing green? And at the end of the day, we need to see more green year round on those farms and on farms around the country in order for us to improve soil health, make us more resilient to these extreme weather events, and draw down atmospheric carbon that we've been pumping into the atmosphere for the last 100 or so years.
Well, thank you. And I think one last question. I think we're kind of running out of time. There's 2-3 more minutes. And that is kind of what are the obstacles or the challenges to implementing these practices? I mean, you're kind of doing it and exploring and innovating, but what are the challenges that farmers face who want to do this, make this transition?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the opening, I think, some of the barriers include social acceptance. I was talking to one of my staff members who connects with farmers in Nebraska, and there's a farm in the community that they're working in that has been trying to shift to climate smart and regenerative practices, but it's not as neat, it's not as clean, and their kid is getting heckled at school from the kids of the other farmers in this community because they're not considered good farmers anymore, because socially the tradition is you keep a very neat farm, and a neat farm is an example of a good farmer. So there's social barriers that are often overlooked in this. The other barriers include certainly the perceived increase in cost and the potential for reduced yield and other real or perceived risk. But the real barrier, the greatest barrier, I think, as we think about it and as we've been learning from farmers around the country, is knowledge and the knowledge that the knowledge to make the transition. And for a lot of people, I think that's a limiting factor. Certainly, there's a cost to making that transition in some cases, and that's why a year ago, at the beginning of 2022, when the Biden administration announced $1 billion to kind of help fix American agriculture, that as part of the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodity program, we applauded that. We went after it. We and about 200 other projects around the country have been funded anywhere from $5 to $100 million, and some a little bit less. And the program ended up pumping now $3 billion. I'm still getting used to using that $3 billion number over the next 5 years. And the idea is that we're going to launch pilot projects around the country to incentivize and support farmers in making that transition from however they're farming now. No shame in it whatsoever. They are food producers. They need to be honored and celebrated and supported. And we also want to incentivize them. We want to incentivize them, and we are, as part of this program that we're launching on pilot projects, about 500 around the country, and we're going to be paying them about $20,000 per farm to implement practices that we know we can measure and verify that they are producing climate-friendly results and outcomes, such as greater soil organic matter, increased biodiversity, and improved air and water quality.
Well, thank you. We'll have a session after the three presentations to do a little Q&A session. So I saw there was a hand up earlier, but we'll get back to, so people have the opportunity to raise questions later. And I wanted to go over to Scott. And also, I just wanted to say that just as an introduction, when I was looking at your Center for Ecology-Based Economy's website earlier today, I saw, for example, that the average meal from the supermarket has traveled 1,500 to 2,000 miles. And I think I read somewhere else that 90% of food in New England has been imported. So I think it's just very interesting. Also, the Maine 1-to-8 climate strategy says that has a target for 2030 that 30% of food consumed in Maine should be produced in Maine, which would be fantastic. But I'm really very happy to have Scott here because he's really worked in that intersection, I think, of like food, climate, and agriculture, and kind of has that kind of, I don't know if I could call you a community organizer, but I'm doing that now, and have that community perspective on this issue. So Scott, if you could talk to us a little bit about, the benefits of farming, and of course the link with food security the resilience not only of farming but also our food system and local food networks.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, and we are part of the local food council here, and there's constant talk about how we need to ramp up our local food system here. I think we all understand the dangers of relying on this industrial food system and everything Dave was talking about. I've got a little slideshow that will just illustrate some of the stuff he was talking about. I can bust through that pretty quick. And I think a lot of these practices that he's talking about can be adapted to New England, and they're going to be different everywhere. But we've had a big struggle here. We've had a big struggle in our community we've seen a lot of farmers, young farmers, come and go over the last 10 years. I was a farmer here before we started CB. We had a pretty robust farmers market that kind of bifurcated, and then some other smaller markets, and that farmers market's gone away, and a lot of the farmers here really struggled to compete with this industrial food system, which is, it's kind of extractive. It is an extractive food system that is making a lot of profit off of this extraction, and if you factor in the externalities, the cheap food that we get is actually a lot more expensive. And we know with public health, local food tends to be a lot healthier. It also, if you're growing food in your community, you're not trashing that environment because you're in community, and the people that are gonna, your neighbors are gonna kind of call foul on you. We're part of the Community Resilience Partnership with the state of Maine, with Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. And we've worked with a number of towns out here, and surprisingly, food security does come up in these conversations when we're starting to talk in communities about what community resilience looks like. And we've heard the term food desert bandied about a bit out here in Western Maine, where there are all these farms, but the farms aren't producing enough food for our area, and people that live in these rural communities that were once farming communities are now having to travel 30 miles to get food that's, as you pointed out, Harold, is typically imported. from thousands of miles away. So I'm just going to run through this slideshow pretty quick. This is just an abbreviated version of a show that of a talk that I've given a number of times. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Let's see if I can get this. Why won't it go? Okay, it worked so good when we were doing this before. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the food system is essentially a big part of driving this climate crisis. Like, it's probably right up there with transportation. In Maine, transportation is much bigger, but globally, nationally, food system is certainly a big driver of the climate crisis. We know it's highly vulnerable to the climate change, to climate instability. And it has this great potential, as Dave was talking about, to help mitigate the climate crisis through increasing biodiversity, sequestering carbon, adapting, building systems that are adaptive. And in spite of its extractive nature and the pollution that it produces, it fails to feed a hungry world. We have a third of the food that we produce get wasted, and a third of the people on this planet are going to bed hungry. So we've got some problems here. And I am having trouble. Okay. One of our big issues is our food system is driven by fossil fuels. If you're eating a typical American diet, which most of us do, eating out, buying food at the supermarket, you're eating about the equivalent of a gallon of oil every day. Just picture like a gallon of crude oil on your kitchen table, and that's about what it's taking to feed every person in this country. Some of the other, big issues that keep me up at night are aquifer depletion. We have increasingly relied on irrigation, on pumped irrigation to increase yields, to meet targets that are set by financiers and by corporations. They're trying to achieve certain profits. This isn't the fault of the farmers per se. A lot of the farmers they're on these contracts. They have to produce X amount. They have to use the seeds, the fertilizers, the chemicals, and the irrigation to meet these standards. And we're seeing our groundwater levels dropping all over the country by cubic kilometers per year in some of these major aquifers. The other one is just flat out heat, and heat and drought, of course, go together, but you can see some of our major agricultural areas are getting hotter, and Maine is one of the hot spots. I know for my, I farmed here for a few years, and excessive heat can really be a problem. I've had crops that don't pollinate because it's too hot. Things that just don't, at a certain temperature, things just don't grow well, and then you're chasing your tail with irrigation. We know about the Gulf of Maine. This is a huge potential for New England to feed itself, and the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than any other place on the planet, any other typical body of water like that in the oceans, and that food system is collapsing out there. And we see the cod, the shrimp, all these things. Harold mentioned pests migrating. The spotted wing Drosophila took the blueberry growers in Maine took a huge hit a few years back. Any soft fruit we were producing was getting hammered by this pest that had just migrated up from the south. So it's lots of issues. The flood, Harold mentioned flood and drought. This was Hurricane Irene, which wiped out a huge amount of production and topsoil loss in Vermont, and even some, more locally. And I've had a couple of situations on my own farm where I lost an entire potato crop one year to 8 inches of rain in 2 days. But on the other hand, I terraced my land and was able to do well in some extreme rainy a season, just like we're experiencing now. We had about 10 years ago where it rained every day for 2 months, and because of the way I had set up my land, I was able to farm through that. That's another shot from Vermont, and you can see how that farm just pretty much washed down the river. And that's, this issue of topsoil loss, and this is the kind of a national map of topsoil loss, and you can see everything that's green, yellow, orange, or red is losing between 1 and over 8 tons of topsoil per acre every year. And this is just standard agricultural practice. If you're losing only 1 acre, you're like doing really great, but still that's not regenerative, it's not sustainable. So we've got to figure that out. And then there's the pollution factor. I taught permaculture in Iowa for a couple of years at the Maharishi University, and I one of the reasons I went out there was because I wanted to travel into that heartland and see what agriculture looked like, and also get up into Minnesota and Wisconsin and look at some regenerative agriculture projects at scale, which I'll show you a little bit. But this is a map of nitrate pollution, which is incredibly toxic and carcinogenic. Everybody I knew in Iowa was freaked out about the drinking water. Any groundwater was contaminated. And you can see that where there's confined animal feeding operations in this industrial agriculture, we have nitrate pollution, in some cases off the charts. And it's another just huge problem with our current system. And of course, all that nutrients that we're putting on the land, chemical fertilizers, combined with extreme weather events, we're creating dead zones in the mouth of every river that's in an agricultural area. Of course, the Gulf of Mexico is one of the most notorious. This gets up to thousands of miles of a square area that's hypoxic and completely devastating another food source, a really vital food source for us. This was 2016 in Aroostook County. We had a severe drought. A lot of farmers just tilled their crops back in, and the topsoil goes off in dust. And then the last bit of dire information before I'll go to the good stuff is this is the rainforest, and this is where we're grazing animals. We're growing soybeans to feed animals in feedlots. And this is actually next to the rainforest, and this is called the Cerrado, and it's a very dynamic ecosystem. These are satellite photographs, and this is in 1 year. You see all these plots crop up where they're growing soybeans, and then the following year, these plots are about 40 acres each, and you can see how fast we're losing land. And this is the lungs of the earth, and there's about 18 million acres a year going. And this is to feed the system that we have in this country and internationally, where we're feeding animals in these kinds of situations, which are, these are not happy animals. We're pumping them full of antibiotics and other, drugs to keep them alive in these conditions. And so this is what our food system is really looking like right now. You can take the same animals and plants and put them into different systems. And this is what I love about permaculture. It's just rethinking how we organize and the systems that we look at. I love Regeneration International. I know there's Regeneration Nebraska. You were talking about Nebraska. I got to hang out with a bunch of those guys when I was out in Iowa. They had their annual meeting in Midwest, Regeneration Midwest down at the university. But just notice those terraces, and what would New England agriculture look like if we could do this to some of our sloping agricultural land instead of till it and have it wash out? If we could start terracing and thinking more holistically about how we're growing food here. So this is permaculture at scale. This is perennial polyculture, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's just growing perennial plants in these vast polycultures. This is Mark Shepard's place out in Wisconsin. There's probably 100 different food and other useful crops here. You can see the way it was working with the contour of the land. This is a hazelnut crop. This is actually over in Wisconsin at Phil Rutter's place. They're trying to develop, these folks will tell you anything you can do with a soybean, you can do with a hazelnut. Hazelnuts are perennial. You can graze animals around them. These root systems will last for hundreds of years, and you can keep coppicing, getting biomass and getting protein and oils and stuff. This is a row of northern pecans. You can graze animals in these agroforestry systems and rebuild the soil. Grass grows better with a little bit of shade. You're sequestering carbon in these trees. This is what, Dave was talking about. Like, this is probably what North America looked like. They wouldn't have been cows. They would have been other grazing animals, but this is what North America looked like before the Europeans showed up. And I don't think the Europeans even recognized that they were looking at a managed ecosystem, and they thought it was some kind of wilderness, but it really was being managed by the native peoples here.
Scott, we're getting a little short on time here.
Yeah, that's pretty much the end of the pictures. And we can talk a little bit about this regenerative.
Yeah, I'd really like to ask you, because of your experience working, as you said, with the local food council, etc. So kind of making the move to regenerative agriculture locally. How do you work with local groups, for example, food councils or other groups locally who would be who can be your allies locally to kind of at least support that kind of agriculture or create demand for that kind of agriculture?
Well, that's a really good question. Our community garden is a big, at a small scale, doing demonstration projects over there. We work with a lot of kids. A lot of people come through there. They see different ways of growing food. You can walk them through that food forest at certain times of year and put things in their mouth and pick fruit and, go back and see what hazelnut coppice looks like, hardy kiwis, foods that they've never thought of. We have Robert's Farm out here. We have an opportunity there. We're working with the Soil and Water Conservation District has 500-acre demonstration forest, and they're very keen to start a perennial polyculture out there and looking at ways that forest owners can get yields from their property without just cutting the trees and selling them, and developing some food crops within their forests. One of the best things I've ever read about this was written by John Piatti. If we're talking about the American Farmland Trust, he's the director there. He used to be the trust of Maine Farmland, the director of Maine Farmland Trust. And there's an essay he wrote right before he left about farming, reclaiming Maine's lost farmland. And it doesn't give you all the answers, but it really asks the right questions about how we can ramp up food production and regenerate our soils. We lost half of our topsoil in Maine when we cleared the state back in the 19th century. 18th, 19th century. And there's a way back into agriculture here to feed New England that I think involves not cutting the forest down. And I see Azalea here, and her grandfather actually does this in Buckfield, Maine. He grazes animals in a agroforestry system, and it's kind of an unsung hero around here. But that could be done elsewhere. And we have sheep farmers out here that are doing the same thing. Steep, hilly, rocky land up on Streaked Mountain, where they're actually doing it and making an excellent living at it. So there's a lot of possibility.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for that. I think also kind of going back to, in a sense, all these different things come together at the local level. I think there was an article in, about the Portland Press the other day about, climate change will be felt locally. And I think I'm thinking now about Judy and your work on planning and municipal planning. And I'm thinking how, if you work with municipalities, you have volunteer, maybe citizen planners, or who are working on a comprehensive plan, for example. They're very concerned about protecting their farmland. They're concerned about climate change, and they want to support, and they're advocates for local food. And they know what their values are, and they can, express them in the comprehensive plan. But how do they, in a sense, how can communities who have this interest in promoting climate smart agriculture, protecting farmland, and in local food production, how can they, what are the tools that are available to them, or kind of the planning strategies that are available to them in that work? I was hoping you could give us some of the kind of practical tools for, in a sense, addressing this through the planning process.
I'll give it a shot. I've got a PowerPoint, and I just hit, let's see, I just hit share. Is that showing up?
There you go.
Yep.
Nice.
Okay. So the first thing I'll say, being married to a farmer who's also a horticulturalist, is that farming needs to feed the soul every bit as much as it needs to feed the body. And that's why I really like this format, because I think it's really pretty. So just a quick introduction to where I live in state government. Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry is massive. I don't expect you to read this whole thing. There are 4 bureaus. So Ag, Food, Rural Resources, the Forest Service itself, Bureau of Public Lands, so think parks. And then my bureau is this one, Resource Information and Land Use Planning. And we've prepared this summary of the 6 programs that have some things that they do to address climate change. So I don't need to read them all off to you. The resource information part is the Natural Areas Program and the Maine Geological Survey. And then the land use planning part is the acquisition program, Land for Maine's Future, municipal planning assistance, which does include floodplain management, and then Land Use Planning Commission, which is the unorganized territories. So I'll reference back to these programs as I go through the slides. And one thing that I wanted to identify, here's just my overview of what I'm going to cover. I used this presentation series for an age-friendly communities with AARP, so I changed it to ag-friendly because it just fit. Like, oh, just drop the E and we're good to go. So these are the areas that I'm going to go over. And one thing that I did today is I used the notes section of a PowerPoint very extensively, and in a way that, because we're crunched for time, I'd like to provide the slides with the notes, because the notes are going to keep me from reading everything that's there, and it's just like a great set of references. And I noticed that Abby from Maine Farmland Trust is here. I reviewed a document that she worked on heavily with Alex Redfield from the department over in agriculture on what was the name? I'll get to the name of it, but in any event, it'll be published at the end of the summer. And it's just a really good update to the tools that are available to communities to plan for farming. So in terms of tools and strategies, I'll go through these 3: comp plans, open space, and community resilience. Comprehensive plans, as you mentioned, it's the vision that the community has for the future. It's a municipal document. It can support local farms and serves as a catalyst for local agriculture. And because the benefits of local farms are very far-reaching, policies and strategies for farming, supporting farming, can be referenced in chapters across the document: local economy, transportation, ag land base, land use and scenic resources, and more. So in each chapter, you have an inventory and analysis, and you set goals and policies. So you answer questions in your inventory in a comp plan, such as, and I'm going to rattle through this, but like I said, you'll have the notes. Is agriculture economically viable in your community? If it's not, why not? Do farmers need access to more land to sustain and grow their operations? Is farmland being lost to non-ag uses? Are there barriers in your regulations to farming? Are farmers concerned about encroaching developments and non-farming neighbors? I love the bumper sticker, "Don't complain about farming with your mouth full." That typifies this situation very well. Are they experiencing impacts from climate change? And if so, what resources and assistance do they need? Is the community welcoming proactively and supportive of historically underserved farmers? If not, then how could you change that? Are there programs to protect farmland that local farmers consider important to their operations? Are they enrolled in the current use programs? Does the existing land use ordinance recognize farmland as a critical resource in development review? And are there measures to direct new development into growth areas? So those are sort of what's the state of your community questions. And then in terms of policy and strategy, when you're defining the growth area, because that's what you do in a comp plan, where are your rural areas, where's your growth area? A policy is to avoid including soils of statewide importance in those growth areas, because farms can't go elsewhere, development can. And then strategies that support the full range of farming and business practices associated with it. So does the ordinance recommend changes that will help support the viability of farms, encourage compact development, and drive new development to designated growth areas? and therefore, have you integrated farming into an economic development strategy? Have you considered community scale infrastructure like the town of Unity has done that supports farming? Do you actively promote enrollment in current use or property tax programs? And also the voluntary municipal farm support program. By the way, I'm mentioning a bunch of programs here, and at the very end, I've got a list with links to all of them. So, so that will be available in the PowerPoint as well. You can set a goal for farmland protection. You can propose a local bond to pay for acquisitions of agricultural easements. Take a look at impact fees, development transfer fees to steer development to the places where you can protect farmland. How can you partner with neighboring towns and local land trusts? And then you can form an agricultural commission and incorporate goals and strategies that are designed to understand the diverse needs of farmers, because they're not all the same by any stretch. Okay, moving on to open space or examples of some good goals in comprehensive plans, actually. Town of Gorham used safeguard lands identified as prime farmland, very clear-cut goal. Support farming and forestry and encourage their economic viability. This is real clear language. Town of Durham, support farming and forestry and encourage their economic viability. Consider farming and its infrastructure as an untapped part of the economic base and encourage ag as a form of economic development. And then protect them from incompatible development. And then really good examples up in the town of Easton in Aroostook County, where there's a strong Amish agricultural community. They have strategies in their transportation section. One says, share the road, add additional share the road signage near Amish farms, community centers, and businesses. In their local economy section, they say, evaluate the interest of local farmers in the development of a packing, shipping, and grain milling facility. In the land use section, two strategies: market underutilized farmland that qualifies as organic to interested farmers, and develop a land use ordinance that includes a farm and residential district, which maintains natural resource-based land uses, with the highest priority being reservation of large tracts of forest and ag land. And I would argue that that also should recognize the need for farm labor housing. One of the things I wanted to stress is that comprehensive plans they're a big lift for volunteer communities, especially small ones. And so sometimes a lot of what I've just gone over really gets better articulated in an open space plan. Open space plans highlight farmland and other resources, habitat, recreation, but they can be a place where you can really dig into some of this in detailed ways. You can identify threats. You can offer some of the proactive policies we just went over. You can help to identify land that's not in use now in order to bring it back into production. I've already mentioned describing the benefits, both economic, environmental, climate resilience, and community food security. And then it's really useful in many of these planning initiatives, open space in particular, that you can do it alone, but it's a whole lot more efficient to do it regionally, and often makes a lot of sense to do a regional plan because the land base on which operations rely, they can support an interconnected web. We don't live in single towns. Home rule keeps us stuck in our town in terms of land use regulations, but everything else operates regionally. And so you really need to think about regional open space planning and regional planning in general. Whole bunch of links here. And again, this is out of this document that I referenced earlier, whose name is not coming to me, but it's on the last slide. These are linked to open space plan examples. And one that I'll mention in particular that Bar Harbor did, it was funded by a coastal community grant. That is a grant that comes out of the Municipal Planning Assistance Program in my bureau. And then that link there is to a case study, which is a nice, tight 2-page summary of what Bar Harbor did with their funding, who they cooperated with, who their additional funding sources were and what they achieved with the open space plan. So I don't know that I need to go into too many more of these things. I think I've mentioned most of these. Oh, yeah. So one strategy is connecting new and current farmers with Maine Farmland Trust's Farmlink program, which also is linked in the resources. Address barriers to temporary housing for farm workers. I think that's a really important strategy. Identify and evaluate large parcels of undeveloped farmland that could be used in future. What have I not mentioned of these that are in Bar Harbors? Exploring incentives to encourage purchase of locally grown products by municipal programs or local institutions. Prioritize plan development to limit the development footprint on prime agricultural soils and promote a dense and walkable urban core. You're going to focusing on that and growth in your growth area is going to help hugely in protecting farmland and open space. Community resilience plans are another, there's a source of money, as I believe Scott mentioned. The town through the Community Resilience Partnership, that's also linked in the reference section at the end. They proposed mitigation and adaptation, or pardon me, they mentioned the Community Resilience Partnership to get money provides 72 mitigation and adaptation activities that if you follow them, you could receive no match funding. And one of those is supporting or incentivizing local food production and consumption. Many towns are working on this, and it's already been stated, this is reducing the supply chain distance of our food supply, and it will significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions throughout the entire system. Ordinances. This is another one where there's a lot of notes in the notes. I won't go over all of it, so I think I'll hit the highlights here. I think the most important part is flexibility, so that farming can grow and diversify. Let them pursue season extension strategies, renewable energy production or generation, value-added development, farm worker housing, I've mentioned already, agritourism, and then direct marketing activities on their farms. And then recognizing that some farms generate additional income through on-farm activities, such as, local engine machine repair for small engines, or excavation and other daycare and hair cutting salons. There's all kinds of that I'm describing the rural economy, right? That supplements farming income and helps farming operations survive through the year and with economic downturns. I also want to mention that not all farmers are producing food to generate income. Wabanaki food projects maintain traditional land-based practices, and they address the foods of their own community. And similarly, some of Maine's immigrant communities and refugee communities collectively farm to maintain cultural traditions and to produce food to share. Not every farm has the same needs. This is why I go back to diversity and to understand and engage with them to ensure that any ordinance is culturally relevant, that the definition of farming is culturally relevant to those diversity needs. One of the techniques that GrowSmart has actually described really well, and I've got a link to it in the notes, is this notion of a maximum lot size rather than a minimum lot size in rural districts to avoid fragmentation. I'll try to describe this, but I don't like the title of this thing Nancy, I don't like this title, but anyway, it's called the maximum solution, minimum lot size and densities in the rural district. But anyway, so here's how it works. So a maximum lot size might be 1 acre and a maximum density might be 1 unit for every 10 acres. So on a 50-acre parcel, this would allow 5 houses on 5 lots, leaving roughly 45 acres as usable farmland. That's really different, right? 5 lots, 5 houses on 5 lots, 45 acres. Instead, 10-acre zoning, you've got 5 houses, boom, 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 boom. That's what Vermont looks like, because they've got a 10-acre, an exemption from subdivision if you create a 10-acre lot. So there's 10.1 acre lots all over southern Vermont with McMansions on them, and loss of agricultural soils, habitat, and all the rest. So I think this is I don't know if I described this well, but the GrowSmart handout is really good to give you a visual of how that works. Another technique is agricultural overlay. So that's an overlay on top of your other districts where certain uses are allowed. So the overlays are not restricted by the borders. You're covering multiple zoning districts. And what it does is it delineates, it's identified and delineated by productive ag soils and contiguous areas of active farms. And in those districts, you can allow additional ag-related or compatible non-ag businesses by right, so permit by rule or with no permit. You can limit the expansion of infrastructure, such as roads and sewers, so keeping development in your growth area rather than creeping out into these areas. You can institute additional development guidelines, such as buffers and site plan reviews. You can allow low density development or require new subdivisions to be clustered. You can prohibit or use that maximum density technique I just mentioned, or maximum lot size rather. You can prohibit non-ag development and be the sending zone for transfer of development programs. So there's a lot of techniques in there, lots of tools that you can work with. And then one thing I really want to stress before I finish out here is involvement. Ask farmers to identify the farmland they consider important. Sometimes it's not those prime ag soils. You can't just do a mapping exercise. It's where they're working, where they've added and augmented the soils in the ways that David talked about, and where they're grazing. So those sometimes are not the soils, and just the technical mapping does not always overlap with where the actual operations are occurring. And you need to talk to the farmers and involve the farmers with what their needs are from a land-based point of view, from an equipment point of view, from a access and transportation point of view. And then also the other involvement, local and regional land trusts are hugely important here. County extension agents where they're available, they're not everywhere. And then I mentioned, and I've got a link there for Alex, he's our farm viability and farmland protection specialist in DACF. And then I have to mention planning for farming with conservation easements. Maine Farmland Trust is also linked at the end. They've got huge variety of resources on donated, purchased easements, ways that they buy, protect, and then sell farms. So I'm not going to go into all of that detail. It's tremendously helpful. Working Farmland Access Protection Program at the Land for Maine's Future is a source of money, as are philanthropic donations through the Maine Farmland Trust. So there's definitely a permanent solution here for some of the best farms in your communities. And then here's the list of the resources. And I didn't, so again, I'll just flip through it. The regional planning organizations are on my website, as are technical assistance programs within the municipal planning assistance programs. There are some example farmland ordinances there. There's the Maine Farm link, that's on the Maine Farmland Trust website. The Voluntary Municipal Farm Support Program is on the DACF website. There are a bunch of, I'm not going to go into the tax incentives. I've got links here to describe them in information bulletins, links to the Community Resilience Partnership, and then to Land for Maine's Future. And boom, there's the title, Cultivating Maine's Agriculture Future, a guide for towns, land trusts, and farm supporters. Really good resource, goes into significant detail. I borrowed heavily from it in the examples I've given you today. It is a reworking, reissuance of a publication that came out 10, 15 years ago, I guess, and a super great resource. So I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully I haven't gone over too much. Let me just end. Stop share. Stop share. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we'll share that presentation with all the links, etc.
Okay.
With the participants afterwards. Thank you so much. That was really a very comprehensive presentation, and I think there was a lot of information there. There's like a ton to explore further based on that presentation. I also wanted to, before we kind of open it up for everybody, I just wanted to invite Abby Farnham from the Maine Farmland Trust as well. She's here, so I just wanted to invite you to maybe react to some of the things that you've heard, to the different speakers. Any thoughts or questions that you have before we open it up for everybody?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, and thank you, Judy, for the shout out about the Municipal Guide. That's a project that we're collaborating on with Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and the original guide we published back in 2011 with American Farmland Trust. So we look forward to kind of finishing that up and sharing that out with everybody the next few months. But for those who aren't familiar with Maine Farmland Trust, we're a statewide nonprofit working to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming. We have a staff person, Sarah Simon, who's our climate resilience specialist, and she's currently working with a pilot group of 16 farms in collaboration with Wolfsnack through the Soil Health Network. And this is a project that sort of supports farms in learning about the effects of different farm management practices and kind of deciding, which practices to use in the future. So our climate resilience work is really focused on how, farmers are already experiencing impacts of climate change, and really we want to make sure that they have the support and resources they need to adapt to these impacts and transition to or increase the use of the sort of adaptive practices that Dave discussed. So climate and agriculture is a big focus of our policy work, and then we also provide technical assistance to towns on farm-friendly policy and planning strategies. And I think my colleague Thatcher, our municipal policy associate, is on the call too. But so this webinar is super relevant to so many areas of our work. And through our municipal work, where we definitely, we encourage towns to incorporate farmland protection, farmland access, local food production goals, and strategies into their climate action plans. And that's such an important starting place because, working lands conservation in and of itself is such an important climate resilience strategy. But this topic of sort of, towns' role in supporting climate smart agriculture is one that we haven't really seen in action too much, apart from maybe some examples of towns promoting or prioritizing the use of soil health practices on municipal owned land that they lease to farmers. But so I'm really happy to be having this conversation with all of you and learning together with all of you. And one idea I can think of that I'd love to pose as maybe a discussion for the panelists, or certainly like municipal staff or officials who are present, is that there are so many resources that are going to be available to farmers in terms of increased amounts of like state and federal funding and private funding for kind of climate smart agricultural practices. And I'd love to hear kind of what people think about the role that towns could play in making farmers more aware of these resources and connecting them with these resources. And then kind of if folks feel like that's a role that towns could really be involved with, kind of what would need to happen in order for towns to feel really equipped to kind of share out those types of resources that are available for farmers. Thanks.
Anybody on the panel want to?
I'll take one shot at that. Scott, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in working with all the communities, these really small rural communities out here, that farming is, a part of the community, and in some cases is threatening to waterways. And one of our ponds out here is being contaminated by a farm. They finally figured that out. The towns seem to have very little capacity. Like when we're in there working with the partnership, it's just the capacity seems so low. So I like what Judy was saying about a regional approach, and letting farmers know that there's, like, if MFT had a kind of a presence out here, or MAFCA had a presence out in this area, I think it might work better than trying to put. It's like everything we ask the towns to do, they're like, we have no capacity. We're overwhelmed. We can't keep up with what we're doing. So yeah, just kind of throw that out there. It's tough for these little towns.
So I would say the same thing, and would add that the regional planning agencies have a connection to the towns through the membership, because they're membership organizations. The towns are the members of the regional planning agencies. And you can use the regional planning agency to use their network to get information to the towns that can then get, posted, sent out in a mailer to any farm that's enrolled in current use, because what that is, or a posting at the of information that's available, or resources or people who are available to the farmers at the town office, because everybody's got to register their vehicle or their dog, or whatever it happens to be. So there is a conduit there, but I wouldn't want to rely on the towns so much just because of that low capacity, but they are the place through which information can reach people, if you think creatively.
Dave, in terms of like networks, farmer networks, in particular, maybe one thing I think is farmland protection, but another thing is also if they want farmers who may want to do climate smart agriculture, but are there networks, farmers networks, that they can in a sense reach out to, or that communities can, farm advocates locally could reach out to and involve, or do you know anything about that?
Well, I think in Maine we're fortunate to have organizations like Maine Farmland Trust and MAFCA who are providing that conduit for farmers to access information, and I think that we probably are leaders amongst other states in terms of our ability to get information to farmers. I think that and I think it was Abby that mentioned it. You're so right. There's going to be so many resources, and in particular financial resources, that are going to be available to farmers in the coming years. And the federal government is a good example in the program that we are part of. But there are, I think, and indications and from what we are seeing and hearing is that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Like that's some federal funding, but I think that the private sector and foundation funding towards climate work and agriculture and food is I think it's a huge growing opportunity that we're going to be seeing here soon, and we are already seeing. And I think that certainly the Biden administration was hopeful that the partnerships for climate smart commodities would then leverage additional private sector funding to support this transition to a more climate friendly food and fiber production system. And I think groups like ourselves and others here in Maine, MFT and MAFCA and Cultivating Community, and as well as our local water and soil and conservation districts, USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Services. There are a lot of resources, and certainly extension as well, and DACF too. So there's no shortage, I think, of people working on this issue, and I think there's probably an increased amount of collaboration that we can see amongst all of us to make sure that we're getting information, accurate and timely information, into farmers' hands. And I agree that relying on towns to do much of that is going to be difficult, but I think that that's where the rest of us can come in and find ways to support.
Well, thank you. Any other questions from participants to the panelists or Abby? Well, I actually have a question, and that is in terms of, I think one of the things you said, Dave, when we talked last week, was about meeting farmers where they are. And I think one thing that I've been curious about is, you said there is increased federal funding for climate smart agriculture, and I'm wondering, like, also at the state level and even at the municipal level through municipal farm support programs, etc. So or easements as well, which MFT has stewarded several easements. So what's the level of, let's say, incentives in these various programs like Land for Maine's Future, for example, or in an easement to give extra points, for example, if the farmland is managed in a certain way in let's say according to regenerative agricultural practices. Is that something that's considered? You don't want to do that because you want to, the farmer will should be given freedom to do whatever, in a sense, what practices they want, or should there be what level of incentives should there be through these programs and easements, etc.? Oh, you're up.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it can be both incentives, but also there are a number of programs at USDA, NRCS that are available to farmers to help support conservation practices, the EQIP program and others. There are a number of programs that are available to everything from improving laneways to covering manure storage facilities and things like that. So there are opportunities out there that aren't necessarily incentives, but are grant opportunities for farmers to reduce the risk of runoff and things like that. But I think that incentives are absolutely something that are going to help farmers transition. I mean, I think the hope is that we're going to see a period of time that we're in now and that we're going to be in for some time, but that I think could be considered a transitionary period. But I think my hope is that we would someday find on a farmer's P&L an income line that isn't for the product they sold, but is for the outcome that they produced. And so I think that what we're seeing across the country is markets evolving, where farmers are going to be able to tap into those markets to sell their the outcomes from their practices, and whether that's carbon storage or increased biodiversity or reduced water usage or things like that. I think it's going to be different around the country depending on the region you're in and what you're facing, but there's going to be that opportunity. So I think it could be seen as an incentive, but it could also be seen as a business opportunity for farmers. Because what have we seen over the course of human history when we think about the environmental issue? If you make it about economics, things happen a lot faster. And so the opportunity to give farmers a business opportunity to be paid for their stewarding their shared natural resources, our shared natural resources, in a way that benefits all of us, I think is a huge opportunity and one that we're seeing happening.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, I just want to quickly share my screen to show you that the workbook for farmland projects, can you see this? Proposals that include information on how a successful application would advance supporting climate conscious ag principles will receive bonus points. I don't need to read all of this, I'll let you eyeball it, but this was incorporated into the Land for Maine's Future workbook just in the last year. And so it's a bonus point opportunity for projects that can demonstrate existing and planned practices aimed at maximizing carbon sequestration, minimizing emissions, and preserving climate resilience habitat. So it's a start.
Yeah.
Within the existing workbook for working farmland access.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Judy. Any other questions, comments from the panelists or from the audience? Can't see any raised hands.
Yeah, one thing we didn't talk about that has been talked about a lot in the local food movement is in terms of incentives is getting food into local schools, local food into our schools, and that to start to create markets where farmers can scale. And once farmers can scale, then they can start to bring prices down. But it's kind of this chicken and egg thing. A lot of the farmers around here aren't big enough to supply our school system because they can't. The prices are so low that they can't afford to scale. So if we could start to figure out how to subsidize farmers to be able to get food into the schools, that seems like another way we can start to ramp up. Another thing too is processing infrastructure. That could be important for some of our smaller towns to host some processing infrastructure, because we have a short growing season, although as you mentioned, it's getting longer. To be able to start processing food. I mean, we had 100 years ago, we had all kinds of food processing out here, corn canneries and other food processing stuff. And so there's a couple of other economic options.
Thank you. Let's see, we're on time. So I think, Maggie, do you want to give us a wrap up? Oh, it's McConaughey.
Sorry, I'm not the host anymore and it wasn't letting me unmute. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to Dave and to Scott and to Judy. Thank you, Harold. This was a great conversation. I learned a lot. And just a reminder to everybody in attendance, we have a feedback survey that you'll be getting an email, and I think it's also going to be in the chat in a second. And also another thank you to our sponsor today, Kennebec Savings Bank. And with that, I think we can wrap up, and hopefully everybody gets out, and there's a survey. Hopefully everybody can get out and enjoy the rest of this sunny day.